Hey, listeners, and welcome to the You Are Epic podcast. This is where we honour the people who've helped build not just our industry, but our communities. I'm Angela Hucker, and I am so glad that you're here. So, I'm taking the time to sit down with people who've been in construction for years, people who've been through the ups, the downs, and everything in between. You're going to hear real stories of resilience, growth, and moments that shaped who they are. This podcast is for those that want to learn more from people who've been walking this path for some time, and they're helping to lift up others and quietly making a difference along the way. It's also to show you that your journey matters and your voice matters. And in case you've forgotten, you are epic. Let's get into it. Today's guest is Jen Perkins, an executive leader, licensed electrician, and vocational education specialist with more than 3 decades shaping the future of Australia's construction and energy workforce. Now Executive Director of Learning and Teaching for Construction and Energy at TAFE New South Wales. Jen brings a unique blend of hands-on trade experience and strategic leadership, having worked across FMCG, manufacturing, and training sectors. Passionate about empowering the next generation, she is dedicated to lifting skills, safety, and capability in industries that power our communities. So, thank you so much for joining us, Jen. It's an honour to have you here.
Thanks, Angela. Great to be here.
So, one thing I always love to start with asking our guests, because I am a very curious person, how on earth did you get started in this industry?
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm a licensed electrician now. I've still maintained my license over the many years. Um, but there was a period in time when I was in school and that I decided that I'd had enough of year 11. And so I said to my mum, that's it, I'm leaving school. And she said, well, you're not leaving until you have a job. And so she sat me down and we started going through the TAFE handbook, well, the TAFE
Mm,
careers guide.
mm,
Back in the day, it was like a big old phone book. You had to
yep.
flip through, and this is in 1986,
Wow.
and so I just went through that, and I had some criteria. I didn't want to work in an office. I wanted to do something hands-on, and I got to electrician as the career, and I thought, oh, that sounds interesting. And then spoke to a family member who was an electrician, and that's where it started. I enrolled into a pre-apprenticeship course at the time, and from there I was employed by the group that I did my apprenticeship with.
Now, 1986, there were
Yes.
not females working as tradespeople.
No, no, they had to. When I started my apprenticeship, I worked for News Limited, which was a big global press company, um, and they didn't have any female facilities. So much to it upset a few of the boys, but also few understood why. But they had to build me a shower and a toilet, which meant removing some of the men's bathrooms. They just put it next door and got me my own toilet and shower. And that's kind of funny because I still hear that happens today. So what's that, 38 years later or 30 something, a long time later, and I still hear that that happens today. But yeah, so they had no facilities whatsoever for women. I was their first female apprentice in any of the printing industry in Australia.
Wow.
Um, they, so I had to get the approval of Rupert Murdoch at the time because obviously being the chairman, they said, "Oh, we're taking a risk here. We're hiring a woman,"
Yeah.
and so I guess the engineer that employed me, he was quite progressive in his thinking. He didn't see it as he didn't see it as anything too different, but he did know that he had to get Rupert's approval.
Isn't that interesting? Like you've got to go to the owner of the company to get approval to hire a female. Oh my
Yes,
gosh.
yeah, yeah.
So other than, obviously the female facilities, I imagine there would have been a number of barriers you would have faced as well, being a female.
I I did, I guess. On reflection, I could say that I faced barriers, but at the time, I probably didn't see them as
Yeah.
barriers. I just don't, I don't look at things that way. Some really interesting things as I look back on my career. You know, some of the boys were back in the day. They used to have their nudie photos up on the wall, and so they sort of got annoyed that because there was a woman starting, they had to take those photos down. And, so there are all those things which I think are probably pretty common practice
Mm,
back then, especially.
mm,
But um, on the whole, most of the people that I worked with were quite accepting, and they treated me like one of the team. And
mm,
I used to say like one of the boys, but I'd prefer to say one of the team now.
mm,
There was one person, it was kind of funny. There was the leading hand of the workshop who didn't speak to me for my whole apprenticeship, and I never really
wow.
understood why. And I thought he just didn't like me. And then it was the day that I finished my apprenticeship, and they were sort of doing a presentation, and he was the one that presented, my certificate to me or something. And I thought, hang on a sec, you haven't spoken to me for like 4 years.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I stayed there for another few years after my apprenticeship as well. So I was certainly part of that team and part of the furniture there.
So from that point, where did your journey lead you then?
So I was really fortunate. I was 24 years old, and I was given a redundancy. So as most 24-year-olds would do, I went traveling and had a great free holidays when I looked at it. I had this News Limited were moving. I did my work and apprenticeship at the Surrey Hills plant in Sydney, and then they were moving to a brand new facility in Western Sydney. So I took the opportunity to take a redundancy, went travelling for a few months. When I came home, I got a job with a plastic extrusion company. So as a maintenance electrician, and I worked with them on, they made Glad wrap and Glad
Mm,
garbage bags and all that sort of stuff. Now, for a number of reasons, that was a horrendous job. It was mainly the shift that happened. It was a it was a really bad shift pattern. It was 1 week of days, 1 week of hours, 1 week of nights, and so you just never felt like you were
mm,
getting in the swing of things. You didn't know whether you were awake or asleep or
mm.
whatever. So I worked with them for about probably 6 months, and then landed a job with Kellogg's Australia. So in
Okay.
obviously food, fast moving consumer goods, which is the FMCG. As my position there was called a technical facilitator. Now, Kellogg's, really great plant to work in, really modern. As an electrician, it was a really great learning experience. But also, that's where I started taking my step into leadership. And
Mm,
they had some really good training programs. They put me through a Masters of Business and Technology, and were a really supportive employer. Being an American company, they had really strict, really good manufacturing practices,
mm.
so they followed GMP, which is good manufacturing practices, and but also electrically, they had some really interesting work as well. Yeah, so I stayed with them for about 7 or 8 years. Um, And I worked across the whole plant there. It was amazing. It was, as I said, really good experience. I learned a lot about, I guess, really advanced manufacturing systems. I was mostly on night shift. I did a four nights on, 4 nights off night shift, which while I was while I didn't have children, that was okay. During that time, I had both my sons were born when I was working there, and which obviously working night shift, being pregnant, was a whole challenge in itself.
Yeah. Yeah.
And but yeah, it was a really it was a great place to learn new ways of working, I guess, for me.
So how did it lead you to where you are now? Like, you said about 1986 and you're pulling out like this phone book style thing to find a job. You landed an apprenticeship and now you're actually, you know, in that space of working with TAFE New South Wales with construction and energy, and bringing your expertise. How did that come back full circle like that for you?
Yeah, well, I mean, I guess when I landed my apprenticeship, it wasn't that easy. I'd probably applied for 100 apprenticeships,
Oh, wow.
and the common thing that I would hear was, "Oh, how are you going to deal with the boys? How are you going to deal with this?" And so one, I knew that wasn't an employer that I wanted to work for if they asked me that question.
Hmm.
But you know, I was lucky enough to get a position with News Limited. So after Kellogg's, and I'd still face those same kind of comments when I was applying for positions. When I came back from travelling, there was a couple of larger companies who would, I think they'd get me in for an interview just to see what I was like. Oh, you don't look like an electrician. And I think, I don't know what an electrician's supposed to look like.
Yeah, what do they look like? That's right.
Yeah, and same comments about how would you keep the boys in line? Well, that's not really my job to keep the boys in line. But anyway, so while I was at Kellogg's, my second son, he became quite unwell. So I had a bit of time off then. And as once he recovered, I got a new job with Suntory, who were there. Well, it was called Cerebos in Australia, and they are owned by a Japanese company, Suntory. They make fountain tomato sauce, white crow tomato sauce, all the sauces. They do Aldi products and a few other things. So that was interesting, but it was too challenging with my son's medical appointments and a few other things that were going on. Also, it was shift work. When you've got children and trying to do shift work, it just doesn't go hand in hand. I think I was living on about 3 or 4 hours sleep a night. It has its benefits though, because I can sleep anywhere now. If I set up, like I've got a flight later today, and I know that I'll just get on the plane and go to sleep for an hour. so, um, so I then started thinking I need a career change. Something that's going to work with my family, give me a bit of a work-life balance, but also I think I like to help people. And so I really had to think about what I wanted to do with my career. My mum was a TAFE teacher, and she'd been a TAFE teacher for a long time. And she'd been trying to get me in, like I'd been in the industry now for about 15 years, and she'd been trying to get me into TAFE teaching. And I was like, no, I don't want to be like my mum. And eventually, it was something that fit well with the period of time in my life. So I started part-time teaching, and when you back then, this was in early 2000s, when you start part-time teaching, it really, you're pretty much full-time teaching before you know it, because it was a challenge to get teachers. And I loved it. I loved everything about it. I loved working with young people. Like, you're always, the demographic of my students were young men aged between 16 to 24. So, they are cheeky, they're funny, they're loud, and they eat a lot, So, and so I really enjoyed working with them and helping them on their journey to, for their careers. You'd see
Yeah.
them develop they'd come to you straight out of school, really, as a first year apprentice, and they're green. They're green. They're young boys, and then by the time they leave you, they're often in their relationships. They've established their life. They've got a career. You watch them change from being young boys to being young adults and men, and so that's a really fabulous part of being a teacher of adults that I really enjoyed. Plus, obviously, helping them get a career that's be successful in the career that they've chosen for the rest of their lives. It's something I've never been unemployed unless I've wanted to be. So, and I always say that to people. There's opportunities that a career as an electrician provides opportunities for the rest of your life, whether you stay on the tools or whether you choose to do something else. So I guess after probably about 18 months, I became full-time. And at the time, TAFE New South Wales had they would sponsor new teachers to do a Bachelor of Vocational Education and Training, so adult education degree, which is what I did. So, from being just an electrician, I'd now had two employers that had sponsored me through one through a master's degree and one through a bachelor degree. So, I didn't even I never finished high school. I finished year 10, but I left school in year 11. So that was that's pretty cool, I think. And and I don't have a HECS. So,
Well, that's it as well, and I think it's a credit to who you are as a person, Jen, in that regards, because to me, I always say your attitude defines your altitude. So if you've got the right attitude,
goodness.
the higher you can go altitude wise as well. And
Yeah.
that's a real credit to you that, particularly being a young apprentice and you're being faced with, 100 applications, and how are you going to handle the boys and all the different things that came at you, but you still persisted, and now you're actually in a space where you're basically giving back to the next generation, and you've got them at quite an influential age where you can actually help shape their future for them as well, just with you passing on the knowledge and wisdom that you've got. So I think that's really beautiful to see that, how it's gone full circle from your experience to where you are now. And what I'd love to find out is, like, with the changes from when you started in the early 2000s to where you are now, what kind of changes have you seen in that space?
Um, so I think when I started, and I actually taught for probably 12 years before I went into leadership roles in TAFE. And and during that time, I saw changes in education. I saw differences in levels of maths coming out of school, which was really quite disappointing. In that time, it was no longer compulsory to do maths for the HSC in New South Wales. And in the electrical trade, that had a big impact on, how the success of our students. So we had to provide a lot of additional support. I also recently, probably in the last 10 years, maybe 5 years, I've seen more women coming through, and which is pleasing, but we're still only at about 4% of our enrolment. I've in electrical trades alone, we have 13,000 enrolments in TAFE New South Wales of electrical apprentices, and we have about 4% of those are women. So we hold the lion's share of apprentice enrolments in New South Wales. And so I think we can pretty much say we've still got a long way to go.
Yeah.
I know big industry are, at the tier ones and the government initiatives that they have on large projects across the country to improve the diversity in that is having an influence. Like if I go to some of my campuses in mining areas and in regional areas, I certainly see a larger proportion of women in classes than I do in metropolitan areas. And I've kind of tried to think about why that might be. And sometimes I think, in regional areas, girls have grown up on farms or have grown up doing things where they're considered an equal way before, and nothing's out of reach. They might have to feed the cattle or they might have to ride the motorbike, whatever it is. But in metro areas, we obviously don't see that as much. But I also see what the influences that are coming through the schools. Trades aren't offered as a career for school students unless they're not going to pass the HSC. So it's sort of looked at as a bit of a second tier option rather than having it as a career.
So what do you think schools could be doing, or career advisors working in these schools could be doing to help open that up more?
I think they need to understand trades a bit more. But, one of the really common questions that I get from parents and comments that I hear parents say is, "Oh, how does an apprenticeship work? What do you mean you get paid to learn?" And they really don't understand how an apprenticeship works. And they've been to the school's careers days, and they've spoken to the school's career advisors, and they haven't been able to get that information. I've spoken at a few careers advisors days, and they ask me the same questions. And so they really don't have an understanding of how apprenticeship works and what the opportunities are once you have an apprenticeship. My oldest son, I had to go through the same thing with him because he wasn't getting that information from school. And surprise, surprise, he's an electrician, but now he's worked in facilities management, and he's a project manager and stuff. So, being an electrician was the start of his career and provided him with that foundation skills to make him a really good facilities manager.
Now, with this, because you're working specifically in the construction and energy space with TAFE New South Wales, and there's obviously a huge shortage of labour, and there's a huge shortage of electricians in this space. What do you think needs to happen to be able to make this space better to attract more people to come in and do an electrical trade?
Yeah, I hear this question a lot, and it takes some policy changes, certainly, and employers' incentives. So I think the infrastructure targets, on large projects across the country are awesome. I think that incentivises larger organisations to have improved their apprentice numbers as well as diversity numbers. We're not seeing a huge uptick as we should be. So that means they're not being employed in the industry. Any apprentices, there's no additional apprentices. We're pretty much stable in our enrolments. In saying that, we've got close to 40,000 apprentice enrolments in the construction and energy sectors in my faculty. What I'd like to see is I'd like to see government revisit the adult apprenticeship model. At the moment, employers don't often employ adult apprentices because it's too expensive for them.
Mm,
So how can employers be incentivised
mm,
to, it'll cost them $400 a week extra to have an adult apprentice, so it's really difficult for them,
mm,
especially for small to medium business, to
mm,
have a number of adult apprentices, um, when it's going to cost them so much, for them to see the value
mm,
in that work. Same as for women returning to work, they're often adult apprentices. They're deemed adults at 21.
mm,
That means that if they've left school, they've gone to uni to try something out at uni.
mm.
Wham bam, they're 21 years old already. So
Yeah.
they really struggle to get an apprenticeship. So incentivizing and genuine incentives, whether that you know wage subsidy or something for adult apprentices, it will help. One, it'll help women return to work, maybe after
Mm.
with a career change or after having children or whatever. But it will also um, help men come into the industry also wanting a career change
Mm.
or looking for new opportunity.
No, and I think that's great because there's a lot of, people who I say they do their lane change. So they might go through, they might have, their corporate career or things like that. And it just gets to a point where they're like, I'm done. I actually, because now there's obviously a lot of focus to get, for people to get in to do a trade as well. And they're like, oh, I might actually go and, be an electrician. And the number of people who've come to me and, they're mid, they're in their 30s or 40s. And it's like, oh, what's involved with being able to go get a trade? And it's like, well, again, it's that flip side because SMEs can't afford if you've got more than one apprentice at an extra cost per week and there's no subsidy for it, why would you employ an adult apprentice then? Like it makes no sense. So
Yeah.
unless there is, you're spot on there, unless there is actually some incentive there from the government to be able to help businesses be able to do that, because there are people who are genuinely interested in getting involved in doing a trade at a later stage in life as well. So.
Yeah, and it'll open up the careers market as well. So, we're at the moment, it's a very tiny market. We're looking at, 16 to 20-year-olds to employ as apprentices,
Mm,
and in a lot of cases, looking at 16 to 20-year-old males. And even then, they look at, usually, especially in metro areas, they want somebody with their license. So really, they're looking at 17 to 20-year-olds. It's
mm.
a really small
Very
employment
small.
market.
Yeah,
So,
very
yeah,
small. Mm. So, with the space that you're working in, with the construction and energy space, what kind of, because on the back end of that, it's not just about obviously getting the apprentices in, but there is a stigma with the industry. And
absolutely.
it's not a great stigma, unfortunately. So what do you think on the back end of that that the industry could do to help make it be a better industry so it is more welcoming and, like young women, if you think back to what you've been through, like young women not having to go through those issues of wanting to get into the industry, not having to face those barriers, not having toilets on site, because even today there's still, no female facilities on some sites as well. What sort of things do you think the industry could do better to make it more welcoming and break some of that stigma to be able to attract more people to the industry?
Yeah, I mean, it's a massive cultural shift, and so does that come through education? But it's got the people that are working in industry, they need to understand, so it's having, I guess, role models and people there and normalizing that it's, good behavior. This behavior is not acceptable.
Mm,
Having people call out poor behavior as
mm,
well. I'll just give you an example. So in my current role, I had, and I'm in a leadership position, and
mm,
I had somebody in my team speak to me. They were in a plumbing space, and there was a challenging situation in a classroom. And they told me that they were going to remove the female students out of the class because they wouldn't cope with the conversation that was going to have with the rest of the class. And I said, well, hang on, I do not treat them any differently to how you would treat any other
Mm.
student in that class. And the two people I was talking to genuinely thought I was nuts. They didn't understand. They said, oh, well, we're just being a gentleman. I said, don't be a gentleman, because that's not being a gentleman. That is separating someone based on their gender.
Mm.
So there's a massive cultural shift in uh, what needs to happen, and that comes with understanding. So, um, somebody that speaks up is
Mm.
is is not aggressive, or is not. I can think of a whole lot of words that I've been called because I've got, a strong voice in.
Voice.
Yeah. And so, you're not aggressive, you're not an agitator, you know, I've had people call me all sorts of things. But, setting the expectations of the industry. What can you do on site? Behaviour that's unacceptable needs to be called out. And whether that's for women, it's not just for women. I wouldn't
Mm.
want my sons, subjected to some of that behaviour,
Mm.
So, one, it's not a women's problem. Two, call out, have the gumption. Leaders on these sites need to have the gumption to stand up to unacceptable behaviour. I always say to my team, the behaviour that you walk past is the behaviour that you accept.
Right.
And so, sometimes I have to pick my battles, because otherwise I'd be battling 24/7. But it really is. It's you know, so that's the leaders on site need to understand the value, how to attract people to the industry, and how to keep them in the industry.
Mm.
Retention is just a bigger problem as the attraction piece.
It is. And, for me, because that's obviously the space that I focus on, because, you can get the people, but the work is actually in what do you do once you've got them?
Yeah, yeah,
And that is the big piece, because that's where, that's their career as well. You're dealing with humans, you're dealing with people, you're dealing with people's lives and their well-being, and the ripple effect that can have in a community as well, and, the whole industry. So,
yeah. And looking at, one, there's also huge self-harm rates in the construction
oh yeah.
industry, and so, mental well-being is, and looking after workers is really important. Um, and so, reviewing it, I think in construction, working those, most people work 6 days a week,
Mm.
and working 10, 12-hour days.
Mm.
That's really long. Do we have to do it that way? I understand it's driven by the dollar, but and the time frames on the project. But things like having that flexible working arrangement, so that maybe delayed starts, having different pre-starts throughout the day,
Mm.
and just reviewing the way that we as an industry work.
Mm.
Not accepting poor behaviour, having a flexible working arrangement. People have got a life too. They don't just work,
Right.
for to pay their bills. There's other,
Mm.
they want to enjoy their life, and especially this generation that's coming through now, they expect more out of their life than, say, what the people that I worked with when I started my apprenticeship. So
I agree, because we're of the same era. So it's like, the generation now don't want to be doing those 12-hour
yeah,
days. They want better work-life balance.
yeah, and good on them, I reckon.
Well, they're,
But
they're showing us what we've done wrong, I
yeah,
think.
yeah,
Because we certainly didn't have, and you speaking about working night shift and having a family and, that balance and everything, like how much better it would have been if you had a more flexible work-life balance as well when your children were younger.
yeah, and it would have been. And sometimes I remember I slept in once, when must have been when my oldest son was in kindergarten, and well, I think prep they call it in other states. But the schools rang me, and I've obviously answered the phone like half asleep, and they must have thought that I was the worst mother in the world. I mean, I've been on night shift.
Yeah.
So yeah. Uh,
So, for the industry moving forward, because obviously you're in the space of training the next generation coming in to enter the industry, what would you like to see for the industry moving forward?
I'd just like to see it to be a nicer place to work.
Mm,
I speak to, I was at a careers day, oh, not a careers day, an industry day recently, and they were all asking the same questions. And there
mm,
would have been 70 people in the room. And I asked them, I said, well, how many of you, and they work in education, like they're aligned to the industry, but they're also interested in education. I said, how many of you have encouraged your children to go into trades? One person in the room put their hand
wow.
up.
Okay.
And I thought, and I said, okay, so let's think about that. Why wouldn't you want your children to go into trade? And
Mm,
they all said it was the environment.
mm,
They said, oh, I don't want to put my kids into that environment. I thought,
mm.
okay, here we are, as a group promoting trades as a viable option and
Yeah.
as a great career, but we're saying that, so something's got to give. How are we going to fix it? And it has to happen as an industry as a whole and as individual organisation. We know there's toxic organisations out there,
Mm.
and should there be penalties to them, when they are awarded a contract and then don't follow through with their obligations for that contract? I don't know what the answer is, but they're just some of the things that I hear.
And I just even reflecting back on what you said there about there's 70 of you in a room and only one of you would actually promote it, but you're all working in the space. Like, how can you then authentically promote something that you actually don't believe in because you wouldn't put your own children there?
Yeah, exactly. And even if I look at myself, I've got two sons, and I have
Yeah.
one that's in a trade and one that's not. The one that's not, totally, he's in the right career for
Yeah.
him and his personality. But that's already 50% of somebody who's a trade advocate.
Yeah.
So
Yes.
yeah.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. So, if for leaders, because you're a leader in this space, so for leaders, what is three things that leaders could do to just start help shifting this dial? If you had a magic wand and you could wave it and just went, okay, boom, this is everything that you need to do, and there was just three small things, like three bits of low-hanging fruit or something like that that leaders could start to do, what would your wish list be?
So I would, on construction, I would have flexible working arrangements. And what I mean by that is late starts, maybe do a pre-start at 6 and then a pre-start at 10, something like that. Still getting your length of time through the day. You're still getting people, if the ones that start at 10, they're sort of doing a pseudo afternoon shift, but still finishing before, noise restrictions or whatever come in. And but that way it enables people, if they're family orientated, they can drop their kids at school. If they
Mm,
want to go and work out in the morning, they can do a workout and then still come to work. And it just gives people those flexible working arrangements. I would also really, culture on site needs to be tidied up. Um, and it's the unconscious biases that you see, you know, and you can see it as a woman walking in. I see it. I'll walk into a workshop or I'll walk into a trade space, and um, and people will automatically go to my colleague, or well, the people that report into me because they are
males.
males. So removing those unconscious bias. How do you do that? It's just it's through presence. Having female leaders, having
Mm,
um, Aboriginal leaders, normalising the situation.
mm,
It's like me as a teacher. I used to walk in and my class, what are you, the maths teacher, miss? Yeah, no. And, so but for me, for the campus that I taught at, it became normal for them. They saw me there. After 6 weeks of realising that I wasn't the maths teacher, they would, it was normal for them to have a woman as an electrical trade teacher who knew stuff, you know,
Yeah. Yeah.
and so normalising the behaviour, and obviously facilities is the next thing. Clean lunchrooms, clean bathrooms that don't smell like men's wee,
Yeah. Yeah.
you know, and not the unisex bathrooms because
Yeah.
for women that just doesn't work.
No, it does not work
Yeah,
because men are not clean. Women are not clean either. Like I've seen
yeah.
some pretty foul women's bathrooms as well, but
Well, 100%. Yeah,
yeah, but let's just keep it so women can have a bit of privacy as well, especially, when they've got their periods and things like that as well.
yeah,
So,
yeah, absolutely. And like the calling out, having leaders that aren't afraid to call out the unacceptable behaviour.
mm,
You know, that's the only way. If you let it slide, it's going to keep going. And there's some really shitty things that happen, uh, you know, that are really, well, I can't believe it still happens. So,
it's 2025 and there's honestly, my mind gets blown pretty much on a daily basis with some of the stories that are shared with me. So,
yeah, yeah, I can imagine. So,
yeah, yeah. So thanks for that, Jen. That's really valuable advice. So in closing, what I'd love to ask you is that if you had a young apprentice sitting in front of you, what would be your words of wisdom that you'd love to pass on to them to be able to help them on this journey?
I guess what I always say to them, the ones that are really making a career of it for themselves, the world's their oyster. Have they can stay in a trade and be a tradie and have a long and successful career in a trade. But also, if it's something that, and you can have a real great variety, especially as an electrician, and that's the one that I know the most. But even for carpenters, they can become builders and expand
Mm,
and do residential stuff, but they can also go into commercial stuff. Plumbers can do their cert 4 and get their plumbing. But as an electrician, you can work across multiple industries. You can
yeah.
work in construction, you can work in manufacturing and industrial sort of work. You can work in residential. But it's also just the beginning. I always say I used to say to my students, when they graduated with their capstone, so they're finishing their TAFE work. They've got their P plates on now. They've just
Yeah.
had 4 years of their L plates, and they put
Yeah.
their P plates on now. And that's when you really do start learning.
Yeah.
Um, and then it's a stepping stone. If you want to do further education, you can do either certificate level, or you can do a degree. And like I've got 2 degrees. It's really been the footprint for a successful career.
I love that. I love that. Well, thank you so much for being one of our silent and remarkable leaders in the industry and for sticking it out, Jen, because I know, certainly through the time from when you started back in 1986 to now, almost 40 years later, like it wouldn't have been an easy journey for you. So thank you for sticking it out. Thank you for what you're doing to help give back to the next generation with the education and helping support them and see them grow and thrive and start their careers as well. You're remarkable, and I really appreciate, everything that you're doing for the industry and everything that you're doing to help support the next lot of people coming into this industry as well. So thank you so much for your words of wisdom and everything that you're doing.
Oh, thanks, Angela. Lovely. It's been an experience, my first podcast. And so, yeah, it's been interesting. And I love the industry. I wouldn't have it any other way.
No, we really appreciate your time. So thank you so much, Jen.
Thanks. Bye.
Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to this episode today. I hope this conversation gave you something that you can take with you, whether it be a little bit of insight, inspiration, or maybe just a reminder that you're not alone. If it resonated with you, please share because we're better when we help build each other up. And remember that your experience, your story, and your journey, it all matters more than you know. Until next time, stay kind, stay connected, and never forget, you are epic.